It's weird to be bringing this idea back up again. I feel like because we've already made the videos talking about this guy and talking about a trade to this team, it's so weird to revisit it because I feel like we've already turned over that stone. But the other day, we had ourselves an article published on dailyfaceoff.com. Frank Seravalli had himself the Summer of Cheveldayoff. Winnipeg Jets, Hellebuck, Scheifele, Dubois, and Wheeler join the trade targets board. You know how this goes. This is Seravalli's trade list. It goes over names in the NHL that could be traded. This article is from June 2nd, so from 3 days ago. And if you scroll down to the 6th overall spot, you'll see a very familiar Vancouver Canucks name. J.T. Miller. Now, before we dive into what exactly it is Seravalli writes about, I wanted to just kind of go over the situation here. Miller is still eligible to be traded at this moment in time. Not until July 1st does Miller's contract extension kick in. And with that contract extension comes a full no-move clause for the first 4 years and a no-move clause in the final 3 years alongside of a modified no-trade. As of right now, JT Miller is still allowed to be traded, and Frank Seravalli is coming at this article from the perspective that says, hey, the Canucks could free up some money, they could go out there and try to trade this guy away. Miller has always been on the trade board, so if they try to get this done now, they could get that money freed up in the process, get some other assets, whatever. This is what Seravalli writes about when it comes to the former Vancouver Canucks 99-point scorer. JT Miller, center wing, Vancouver Canucks. 30 years old, stats, 81 games played and 82 points. He's got 7 more seasons at $8 million AAV. The scoop reads this. The way Miller closed out the season under new head coach Rick Tocchet, it's easy to envision him in the Canucks opening lineup in October. He posted 41 points in 35 games under Tocchet, who will have no problem managing Miller's challenging locker room presence. Ooh boy. Challenging locker room presence. That's a brutal way to put it, but okay. Yet, we know that the Vancouver Canucks were deep in talks with the Penguins to move Miller before the deadline. Those fizzled, and now the Penguins regime has changed. Has that trade partner evaporated? How much will the Canucks push to move him before his no-trade clause kicks in on July 1st? They could desperately use the cap flexibility. You have to allow for the possibility in a depressed free agent market that a team will covet Miller enough to make a play. And so Seravalli is ultimately questioning here if the Penguins' hiring of Kyle Dubas changes the perspective that this team may have when it comes to going after guys. We'd already made a video a few weeks ago going over the extended rumors, or not the rumors necessarily, but the scoop as to what happened between Miller and the Penguins and how the Canucks had this deal worked out, how there was a 3-way trade with Jason Zucker involved, but the Penguins' ownership and coaching staff was like, no. Firstly, we're not trading away Zucker, and secondly, we're not taking on Miller and his financial situation. It's not going to happen. And so now, because the situation is not the same, because the ownership that prohibited the Miller trade in the first place because of his contract is gone, how does Kyle Dubas go out there and navigate this? How different is the perspective of the new ownership versus the old one, where they really placed an emphasis on Miller's contract being a hurdle? We know Kyle Dubas is no stranger to paying his top-tier stars big bucks. We can and we will. That was the motto in Toronto. Now, I know Dubas is under a circumstantially different position in Pittsburgh than he was in Toronto. This is not a rebuilding team that Dubas took over with the pieces to carry them forward into the promised land in the next few years like it was back then. This is an aging core. It's an older team. The Penguins are on their last legs, and the guys at the top are getting older. So do you still want to go for that last-ditch effort? Do you still want to make the 1-2 big trades that will push your team over the edge and break that barrier, get back into the postseason after missing out for the first time in ages? It's a possibility, but you can't go out there and be too certain about these things. In fact, we had ourselves another article published on NHLTradeTalk.com. This was by Jim Parsons back on June 3rd. Trade talks between the Canucks and Penguins are doomed by the Kyle Dubas hire. If the Penguins were talking to the Canucks about a big trade, expect those talks to stop with Dubas. Jim Parsons goes out there and talks about the entire situation with Miller and how Kyle Dubas was hired by the Penguins, and then he concludes that because this hiring takes place, it ultimately puts to rest any sort of a trade idea. Let's read what the piece has to say regarding the reasoning as to how this happened. Coming to Pittsburgh, Dubas brings with him lessons learned from his time in Toronto. Among them is that a core group of really expensive forwards is attractive on the surface, but might not equate to the best possible chances to win playoff games. It's hard to know what his answer would be if you asked him if he'd build his team in the same way again, but there's room for some to say that he probably wouldn't. With that in mind, Dubas inherits a team in Pittsburgh that isn't all that different from Toronto. The biggest gap is the age group of his new core, but it includes some pretty talented people making some pretty good money. Where Toronto has Matthews, Marner, Tavares, and Nylander, the Penguins have Crosby, Malkin, Rust, and Raquel. All players listed from the Penguins have some version of a no-move clause, and that's not factoring in Jake Gensel, who also has a modified no-trade. What Dubas won't want to do is add another player who is aging, locked into a big money contract, and has the leverage of a no-move clause, all of which JT Miller has. It isn't until July 1st, 2027 that the team who owns his rights could force him to submit a 15-team no-trade list. And then you have yourselves the conclusion. It talks about Frank Saravalli and how the Canucks, even if they are desperate, the Penguins are probably out. The article writes that Dubas has other problems to fix that don't include his forwards. He's got a defense to look at and a goaltending situation that requires attention. Miller is not what the Penguins need, and in talking about giving support pieces to his older stars that have control over their exits from the organization, adding Miller to the mix is not the solution. If anyone knows what kind of handcuffs that contract could place on an organization, it's Kyle Dubas. And considering the handcuffs he is inheriting, why add more? Now, when you put it like this, it makes a lot of sense as to why Dubas in particular would not want to go out there and put the Penguins in the same situation as the Maple Leafs were in by adding a player like JT Miller, or not a player like Miller, but a contract like Miller. And so while this conclusion makes sense, a part of me is sort of thinking, okay, what if the Penguins and their ownership is like, yeah, no, Dubas, we want you to just do whatever. Do whatever, make the team better, win. Win now. And Dubas, who had already been in a position earlier in Toronto to even consider JT Miller, a part of me is wondering what if there just is a different flavor here. Because we know there were rumors linking JT Miller to the Maple Leafs earlier this previous season, so if Kyle Dubas has already done his due diligence and he's already looked up what it is Miller offers to a team and how his contract could affect the club going forward, if there already were some conversations about Miller coming over to a Dubas-led team, who's to say that in his new situation, who is more focused on winning now than the Toronto Maple Leafs are, maybe he does circle back. Who really knows? Of course, this is just speculation. It's just me going out there and spitting off the top of the dome. But you can let me know your thoughts in the comment section below. Kyle Dubas heading over to Pittsburgh. What does this ultimately mean for JT Miller and the conversations regarding a trade there? Do you think that it's more aligned with the writer here on NHLTradeTalk.com saying that, hey, it's not going to happen anymore because Dubas knows what it's like to inherit a team that is super handcuffed and he doesn't want to add more handcuffs? Or do you think Dubas, on the opposing perspective, would be more focused on winning now, and therefore more decisive in making a trade for a guy whom his team had already had interest in the prior years? So, you can let me know your thoughts in the comment section below. If you're a Canucks fan, what would you want from Pittsburgh in some sort of a Miller trade, assuming this is even possible? I hope you enjoyed this Juraj 9, and bye.